All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Billy Dees Podcast. I'm absolutely thrilled that you are here. If this is your first time here, we're primarily an interview and commentary podcast. This episode is an interview. On the studio line with me, I have Samuel Moore-Sobel. How are you doing, Samuel?
Great, Billy. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine. Before we continue, I do want to caution our audience. I always do this anytime we talk about somebody who's had a trauma of some kind, some sort of an experience. For those that might be listening that have been through some sort of a trauma, this episode might have some triggers for you. So we don't want that to happen, but I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that we are going to discuss a bad injury today. Let me tell you a little bit about Samuel. Samuel Moore-Sobel is an author, speaker, and columnist. His debut memoir, Can You See My Scars?, is the story of a harrowing encounter with sulfuric acid, trauma, and severe burns. Samuel writes about his experience as a burn and trauma survivor. Samuel has a degree in government and international politics and currently lives with his wife in Northern Virginia. Let's kind of start there. You're in Virginia right now. Where are you from originally? Have you always been in that neck of the woods?
Yes, I have. I was pretty much born and raised in Northern Virginia, and one of the few who's stuck around here. I know it's a pretty transient area, but still here after all these years.
That's good. That's good. A lot of times it's good to stay where you're comfortable. And that's a pretty good area of the world. I'm not too far away from you here in Ohio, and it's kind of the same thing. I'm probably going to make a move towards the Columbus area here sometime soon. But overall, Ohio has been a good place for me. So that's good. What were your early days like? Did you have a big family, brothers and sisters? What was your story growing up?
Yeah, so I had I'm the oldest, and I have a younger brother and a younger sister, and grew up in a happy family. We were very close and tight knit, and parents were really involved in our lives, and love living in Northern Virginia. It was a great place to really learn, and so many different things to learn. And being so close to Washington D.C., my mom used to take us in to see the museums on a weekly basis during the summer, and it was just a great place to understand the world and be ready to take on the world as an adult.
That's great. Sounds like you had a happy childhood. Getting into what led up to the accident, what one of the first things when we first contacted each other, one of the first questions that came to my mind was, what were you doing with sulfuric acid? You were 15 years old, and what led up to the circumstances which caused the accident?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was 15 years old. I was a week away from starting my sophomore year of high school, and I was eager to fit in one last odd job before the summer ended. And I'd been doing a bunch in my community, and so there was someone in my community, a man who lived just a few blocks from my parents' house, and he contacted me and asked me to complete a job for him. The job, when we spoke, it entailed moving boxes and furniture from his garage, as he described it, to a storage facility nearby. It sounded like a job that we could do in a day, and was hired to do this on September 1st of 2009. And as we arrived that day, it was a beautiful sunny day, and thought, hey, things are going to go great today. From the get-go, there was some miscommunication, and at the time, I chalked it up to, well, maybe I misunderstood the goal of what we were doing, but this was a common theme throughout the day. A lot of miscommunication, a lot of changes. When we arrived, we were told, oh no, we're going to take everything from a storage facility nearby, bring it back home to his house, and then take whatever was left over to a friend's shed. And so that's what we did, and we ended up doing that, and the job was taking a bit longer than we thought it would. And I still remember to this day, I remember my dad calling me in the early afternoon and saying, I think it's time for you to go home.
Yeah.
And as we were kind of talking through what was happening, the man's overhearing the conversation, and he says, oh, that my friend's house is just 5-10 minutes down the road. So I hung up the phone and agreed to go with him. And it ended up being a 45-minute trip. We passed
Mm.
county lines, didn't know where we were. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere and didn't recognize my surroundings. We get to this house and it's at the top of this hill. And he asks us he's going to back the truck down to the bottom of the hill where the shed is, where all the stuff is supposed to go. But we meet the woman who owns the house. She goes and she opens the shed and it's just filled to the brim with boxes, furniture, other things. And so we're told we've got to empty the shed to get everything from the truck into the shed.
Yeah.
And a box makes his way into my hands. I look down, it looks like books and hay. And when I say hay, it's literally straw protruding from this box. It's open. There's no tape on it. And she says, just toss it. And so I do as I'm told, and it hits the concrete slab that's nearby that we're supposed to be tossing everything onto. And the second it hits that slab, an explosion rings out. And I see this liquid substance flying towards me. I don't know what it is at the time. I instinctively close my eyes. I feel that substance hit me, and the pain just begins within a few seconds. And it just felt like somebody had lit a match and dropped it on my face. I felt like I was on fire.
Yeah, for those that may be listening, in terms of fire versus, in your case, acid, a chemical burn, any type of burn to me is probably one of the worst injuries, or in the case of a fatality, is probably the worst way to go. But at least with a fire, unless you're trapped, for example, I've had my sleeve catch on fire a few times or whatever, and at least you can put it out. With acid, like you said, the moment it contacts your skin, it's going to keep going until it neutralizes itself. You can't put it out. There's no rolling is not going to help you.
Right.
Can you describe what did you try to do to save yourself? Was there anything you could do? I mean, I guess you just basically had to sustain the injuries.
Yeah. So the big thing that happens, after this occurs, the person who's hired me calls 911. He leads me to the top of the hill and they ask him what the substance was. He doesn't know. So he goes back down the hill and he hands me the phone. And so I'm at the top of this hill alone, feeling like I'm burning alive. I'm talking to the 911 operator. And she's telling me to get water. Water is the big thing. She, pour water on your face, but nobody was there to do that. And I didn't have any water next to me. Eventually the man does come back. He brings some bottles of water and she's telling me not to put water on myself because the acid will go into my eyes and could cause me to be blind. So for a minute, he pours some water kind of haphazardly on me, but then disappears again. And the lack of water really ensured that the injuries were worse than they could have been if water had been applied. So the paramedics eventually arrive. They put me onto this stretcher. They lift me up into the ambulance. And I just remember, Billy, I remember looking around and seeing all these trees surrounding the property and wondering if that was the last time I was going to see trees.
Oh, man. That's my next question was going to be, a lot of times when you go through something like that, you're processing it. I've had a couple of bad falls, and the first thing you do is you kind of I'm not trying to be funny, but you kind of take an inventory, see what hurts. Did you realize that this is really bad? It sounds like you were in fear of your life, for your life, I should say. So you knew right away this was really, really bad?
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't know what it was that had hit me, but I just felt like the pain I was in and the inability. I mean, at one point I'm trying to stand at the top of the hill. I drop to my knees. I can't even stand. I can barely keep my eyes open. And I remember wondering if this was how I was going to die, if I was going to die on this hill, because it just felt like, it was unbelievable amounts of pain. And I was trying to figure out if my eyes were okay, if my mouth was okay. I kind of felt like maybe I'd gotten some of it in my mouth. So I'm spitting, to try to get it out. It felt like this could be the end. It felt really serious, but I just didn't know what it was that had burned me.
Was there ever an explanation for what that type of acid was doing there? Did you, as time went on, did you ever get an explanation as to what that was there for? Because that's a pretty potent chemical to have sitting around.
Yeah. So once I was in the ambulance, I overheard the paramedics talking, and it was relayed to me. They had sent people to, some paramedics and the authorities to ask her what was in the box and why it was there. And apparently, she said belonged to her ex-husband, and that he had it because it was something he used for metal etching. So he would use the acid to do some metal etching. I've heard other doctors say she never handed over the substance, so they could never test it. I've heard some doctors tell me and others that it probably wasn't used for that because the concentration was too high, that it would have burned through the metal just like it burned me. So I never really quite got to the bottom of what it was doing there, other than from the explanation she provided.
When you go through something like this, I've talked to a number of people now who've been in bad automobile accidents and things of that nature. And it seems like from a medical standpoint, there's two phases. The first phase, when you're first brought in, is the preservation of life. Okay. We're going to do what we need to do to keep this person alive. All right. And then the second phase is after the injuries are contained to the point where life is stable, then you move on to the rebuilding, whether it's reconstructive surgery, and then of course you have to tell the patient about rehabilitation and all these other things. So let's go into the first phase first. When you're brought into the hospital, very traumatic injuries, what was the first treatment? What did they tell you? What was done to you when you were brought in?
Yeah, so when I was brought into the hospital, I was placed immediately into a chemical shower, and it was, really interesting because I was the first patient treated in that specific chemical shower. It had just been only recently created, and so it was really a miracle that it was there. So I was there in the chemical shower. Then I was taken to a room, and from the beginning, they're telling me, you're going to be transferred. We're going to transfer you to another hospital that can better handle your case. And so within a very short period of time, I'm medevaced from this hospital to Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. From there, I spend the night in the hospital, and the next morning they prep me for surgery. I go through a debriding surgery where basically they're trying to prevent infection and scrape off the affected areas as much as they can. And so they were able to do that. And then from there, I was discharged. I mean, within 24 hours, that was the end of that. They said there was nothing else that they could do for me, and the rest was up to me. And I had to, I remember going home and being in the back of the car as my parents drove me home, and just really grappling with what my life was going to look like now. Everything felt so uncertain.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I'd be able to get through high school, go to college. I was worried that no girl would want to go out with me because of how I looked. I just remember all of that in that initial period, and really wondering what the future was going to hold.
It hit your face. Did it hit your upper extremities? Where all were you affected?
Yeah, so it got my face, my ear as well, and a little bit on my arm. So I have a few kind of what the scars now look like bullet holes, but also have a one that looks like a starfish on my right hand, and then ones that look like bullet holes on the right side of my arm.
You talked about worrying about your future and all the other things that come with it. How am I going to be received socially and things like that? Did you have any support for your mental health?
I did. And that was something that happened. I went to therapy about 3 months after the accident, and it was really spurred on by just the symptoms I was experiencing. I was having trouble getting out of bed in the morning. I felt really irritable. I just felt these flashes of anger. I was reliving the experience, having flashbacks. It was just something that was following me wherever I went, and going to therapy was something that really helped me. Once, as you say, the initial part is really focused on the physical, but once I'd had a chance to kind of take a deep breath and get through the physical part, or at least the beginning parts of it, seeing those emotional scars, what I would call emotional scars, in some ways those were dominating my life even more than the physical scars that I carried.
Yeah. So you eventually sought treatment for the scarring. How did you begin that process?
Yeah, so I went through, several different surgeries. It was more than a dozen surgeries over
Wow.
this period of time. And, there was laser operations, there was facial reconstructive surgeries. For one operation, they took a skin graft, which was just taking skin from my ear and behind my ear and putting it on the area under my nose. Those were the most troublesome spots because the scar under my nose was actually pulling down my right nostril. And so they were concerned about breathing, and it was affecting my ability to breathe, especially on the right side of my nose. So yeah, had more than a dozen operations over several years. My last operation was only a little more than 3 years ago. And so this was just a decade-long journey, both the
Oh,
physical
man.
and the emotional. I mean, years of therapy, years of doctor's visits. It was a long journey to get where I am now.
How do you, when you're going through this, when you're finding out, this is something we can work on, but it's going to have to happen in phases, and you hear that whole list of medical jargon as far as how the different procedures are going to be done. Do you set milestones for yourself? Do you set like goals? I guess what I'm asking is, how do you stay motivated? Because I can tell you, I would have a hard time staying motivated. I mean, it's very hard not to fall into depression and things like that. How did you stay motivated?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it really was rooted in something that my psychiatrist told me early on in my sessions with him that I've carried with me ever since. And it was this idea that I needed to assemble a toolbox. And if I put these tools into my toolbox, that I could face whatever came my way. And so in my case, I was experiencing symptoms of depression and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Hmm.
And so in order to combat those things, it was assembling that toolbox. And so for me, it was a way to kind of, as you're saying, milestones, there was things that I was working towards. So for me, it was keeping a journal and writing about my experience. It was talking about my experience with people I trusted and sharing what I was feeling and the avalanche of feelings that I experienced as a result of the surgeries and just everything that had happened to me. It was finding ways to get outside of myself and serve others and hear the stories of others so that I wasn't just focused on my own traumatic experience. It was diet and exercise. It was, there was a whole list of things
Oh
that
yeah.
kind of hit, those milestones that I was kind of tracking. And it was hard. I mean, there's some days where I despaired, right? It was easy to not, to just feel like I'm just going to pity myself and I'm not going to get up and I'm not going to keep fighting, because it was a daily fight. It was a daily battle. And I guess that's what I learned, is just kind of taking it day by day and being able to get up every morning. And there's some mornings where I'm going to have a bad morning and there's some mornings where it's going to be great. But regardless, it was just putting one foot in front of the other and just trying to get through that day. And eventually you can build on that. It's like building a foundation. And eventually I was able to build on what I'd experienced and then have developed those tools in my toolbox so that I could kind of combat whatever came my way. It was really through life experience, just continuing to plod away, even as hard as it got at times.
Yeah. You reference, and correct me if I'm wrong, a place of healing. And I presume this is emotionally, psychologically, and so forth. Um, you already talked about it a little bit. How hard is it to get there? And how do you know when you've arrived? How do you know when, okay, this was bad, but I'm through it now? How do you know when you've had that moment?
Yeah, I think it looks different for everybody. And I think, I would just emphasize to your audience, I'm coming to you, more than 11 years after my accident.
Yeah.
So I've had a lot of time to really grieve and heal. And my life looks so much different now than it did then. But I think for me, when I reflect back, I think that when I knew that, okay, I've kind of reached that point. And I think it's several points along the way. And I think that there's certain things I can look back on, and I probably didn't realize it then, but I can look back now and say, oh, wow, that was a moment of growth. That was a moment of coming to peace. But I think for me, the pinnacle of it was being able to look back at my experience and transform my perspective on it. So I think for me, I knew that I had kind of come through this experience when I could look back and see my scars as no longer as symbols of shame or things that I wanted to eradicate, but as symbols of survival and symbols of, I'm proud of the scars that I have. And I can look in the mirror and it doesn't bother me in the same way that it does. Not to say that I look back and I'm happy that what happened happened. Of course, I
Sure.
would go back and have my former face. But I think for me, it's just being able to look back and say, I learned a lot of things that I probably wouldn't have been able to learn if I hadn't gone through this. And so it's just kind of making peace with that and saying, I'm not glad the accident happened, but I see the value that I was able to extract from this experience. And I think that was kind of the moment where I thought, I've come through this. And another thing I would say is having that life experience. I think the great benefit and the gift of life experience is being able to look back and say, wow, I made it through this, so I can make it through whatever I'm facing in the present. And I think,
Yeah.
when I was 15, I didn't have enough life experience to know that life would get better. I
Yeah.
thought I was always going to feel that way. And now in my late 20s, I can look back and say, hey, I made it through this horrible experience that never should have happened. And I have the scars to prove it. And so that can kind of embolden me and ready me for the next thing that comes my way and serve me well in the future. And so I think it's just having that confidence, but also, being able to rest in that knowledge of, hey, I learned a lot here and I've made peace with it, and not really, being in that place where I'm dwelling on what could have gone differently and the what ifs, as it were. I think that's kind of where I knew, I've reached a place of healing here because I'm not dwelling on what could have been and what could have gone differently.
Yeah. Are you to the point now where you're done with any more treatments, any more surgeries? What's the status of that?
Yeah, so my last operation, like I said, was a little over 3 years ago. And, when I was talking with my doctor, he said, well, there's a few aesthetic things I could do. There's a few more things that I could do, but he kind of left it up to me. And he said, I know my burn patients get tired of getting cut open.
Sure.
And I was definitely in that category. I mean, I'd had more than a dozen surgeries over so many years of my life, and I was just ready to turn the page. And, I think at this point, I'm to the place where I'm happy with how it looks, and I'm happy with how I feel for the most part. I mean, there's still consequences of the accident I still live with every day. It's still, when I'm in a place like out in the heat or in a hot room, sometimes the areas can swell a bit and they can itch and be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So there's things I live with, but I don't know what the future holds. That's kind of the unknown. My doctor tells me that I could have farther complications down the road as I age. It might, I might need farther surgeries. I was told initially that I might be at a higher risk for skin cancer because of the scars that I have. So there's, the future's an unknown for me, and as so much of the experience has been. But I guess just for me, I feel like whatever comes next, I'll be able to face it.
Yeah. Well, you're still young too, and I would imagine that as technology goes on, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they might have some different treatments that they might be able to try, and you could cross that bridge when you come to it. But I think that it's good that you're finding a place where you're content as you are. I actually
Yeah.
had the opportunity to talk to a couple of potential people that might be on the program who've had scars for different reasons. And one of the things that this one person said to me was being able to embrace the scars. Like you said, you feel ashamed, or you feel this, that, or you're afraid about the reactions that other people are going to have. But I believe she used the term normalizing scarring. That
Mm.
she's not going to pursue a lot of plastic surgery and things like that because in her case, hers are partly genetic. And,
Mhm.
she feels this is who I am. And, people are either going to have to accept me or not. So I think in your case, obviously, you had an accident that was disfiguring at a certain point. Yet, they did what they could to correct those injuries, and it's never going to be perfect. So you have to reach a point where you feel I'm good now, emotionally and physically. As long as my body is functioning the way it's supposed to, I'm good now. I think that's a good place for you. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that kind of where you're at?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the big concern I had was just, I wanted to be able to breathe. I wanted to be
Yes.
able to, have those
Yeah.
things that are there. And then, from there, I mean, yeah, it's never, like you said, it's never going to be perfect. And, I'm happy with the face I have now, and the scars are, reminders of all I've been through, and they remind me of what I've been through, and they help inform my present. I think they help me be a better husband. They help me be a better manager at work. They help me, they make me more empathetic and understanding and compassionate. And, I see those, as evidence of survival. And the other thing I'd say too, that resonates a lot with me of, we live in this culture where we're encouraged to put, the best pictures on Facebook and Instagram and social
Yes.
media. And, I push against that and try to do the opposite. There's times after surgeries, the last surgery I had a couple years ago, I put a picture of my face, after the surgery, because I wanted people to see, life is messy. I think we can all
Yeah.
relate to that, whether we have scars or not. And there's parts of ourselves that, we wish we could change, and we all carry those scars with us. I think that's the big thing I learned in this journey is that, whether we have physical scars or emotional scars, we all have scars. We all know what it's like to go through adversity.
Yeah.
And we have to, as a culture, I think, get better at talking about what the implications of scars are and what scars mean, and being able to show the harder parts of our experience, because I think that's the only way that others will be able to have hope when they're going through adversity. If we
Yeah.
don't talk about the things that have happened to us, then people just continue to feel alone in their experience. But being able to see someone who goes through something hard and comes out the other side can help inform their own life experience. And that's the value. And for me, that's the redemptive aspect in my story, is being able to share this with others so that it's no longer just this horrible accident that never should have happened, but it's a story that's impacted others for good. And it brings me, and adds a new sense of meaning to my own life and to my own experience.
Yeah. In the process of talking to some of these other folks and then talking to you, I really didn't realize it until recently, but there seems to be almost a stigma that's associated with scars that you don't normally have with other types of injuries. And it seems like the Joker. I enjoy the
Yeah.
Batmans as much as anybody else, but the scars are always associated with somebody who's got a lot of problems. They're a psychopath and this and that.
Yeah.
And you don't too often associate scars with heroes or with beauty.
Mm.
Or with all these other things. And that's the one of the persons that I talked to recently, that she said, I want to normalize scars. I want to make scars sexy. I want to make scars attractive. There isn't something, that we should shy away from. So I think that's a great way to approach this. I think that's a great talking point. The one thing I wanted to ask you too is a lot of times you mentioned, your wife and, your parents, your brothers and sisters, caregivers. A lot of times caregivers in these situations don't get enough credit. And it can be very frustrating, because a lot of times somebody who's recovering from a bad injury, or if they have an illness, a lot of times they can get irritable. They can be difficult to deal with in the industry. A lot of times it's called compassion fatigue. Okay. What would you say? How was that experience for the caregivers in your life? And what advice would you have for caregivers for somebody who's, let's say, recovering from an accident or something traumatic?
Yeah, it's a great point. I totally agree with you, Billy. I think that, for me, this is a story as much as, it's about what happened to me. It's also something that happened to my family. It's something that, affected the lives of my family very deeply.
Yeah.
And, I see a lot of cases where, a lot of times the strain of that, when a couple has a child who goes through something like this, it could result in divorce, or,
Sure.
a lot of things that could go wrong there and be very painful. And so, to my parents' credit, they stayed together, and we really united as a family. And it wasn't always easy, and we all didn't always make the right choice. But, I think I definitely, and I write about this in my book, I definitely, the reason why I'm alive today is because of those four people. It's because of my parents and my brother and sister. Without them, I don't think I could have survived. I mean, I think, I felt so alone. I felt like friends had abandoned me, kind of drifted away from me in life, because they just didn't know how to interact with me. I felt like even extended family members and others had kind of distanced as a result of what had happened to me. And my parents and brother and sister were there, and they showed up. And I think, as far as advice for others, I think the big thing is just 90% of it is showing up, right? As the saying goes. I mean, I think, you've just got to be there. And I think, the big thing too, I would advise others, is you don't always have to understand it. I think I had a lot of people in the wake of the accident try to tell me how to respond, or tell me how to feel, or tell me how to, respond. And, to my parents' credit, they were very, they just kind of accepted me for who I was. And that's what I needed. I needed people to come alongside me and say, hey, I know this is really hard. I don't have all the answers, but I love you. I care about you, and I'm here for you. And I think that kind of attitude can make such a difference, because especially in an injury after what I experienced, I felt so unlovable, and having my family there and feeling their love was enough in some ways to get me through. And so I would just advise that for other caregivers. It's hard and they are the unsung heroes, but hang in there and stick with it. And the last thing I would say is sometimes the person you're, taking care of doesn't realize all you're doing until later. It's only in retrospect they're able to look back and say, wow, my parents were there for me in a way that it must have been really hard on them. And, as I get older and as I kind of progress in life, I can kind of look back and say, wow, and put myself in my parents' shoes, right? Or put myself in my dad's shoes, or, and you just see things differently. And so I would just say that the patience, to let that person come to their own conclusions and see things differently. Maybe they never do, but I think with life experience, sometimes they can look back and see things a little differently. And I think that can really make a world of difference.
Sure. I always try to end on a positive note or a moment of inspiration for those that are out there. There's obviously people who have been through traumatic things as you have. Sometimes those traumatic events are different. They've had troublesome childhoods which has sent them in down the wrong path of life. And with COVID now, anybody who's dealing with a bad injury or any type of may have been dealing with a mental issue prior to this has now been staring at the wall for the last year, and that's not a good situation. What message of hope, what message of inspiration would you have for those people who are really just longing for as much positive information as they can get?
Absolutely. And that's a great point. I think, for me, the opportunity to share my story, especially in the midst of this ongoing pandemic, I mean, there's so many things in what we're experiencing now that I personally experienced back then. I mean, I had to spend the first few months on homebound tutoring and staying at home and staring at the four walls because of the risk of infection. And so much of this time has reminded me of what I went through then. Obviously, there's really important differences, but it's something that I've experienced along this road. And, I would just say to your audience, this is a hard time. And I think, whether it's a hard time now for some people, we're guaranteed to go through adversity. I mean, that's what this life guarantees us. And, for me, I've learned that it's not so much whether or not adversity will arrive, it's about how we will choose to respond. And so I would just encourage people, you may feel like life is out of control, but you have the ability to choose how you respond to situations. And I would just say, hang in there. I mean, I think if you could take anything from my story, I hope you take that, I was able to overcome this experience. I was able to graduate high school on time. I was able to go to college and graduate.
Wow.
I was able to, get out in the world, get a good job in the tech industry, and then marry the love of my life just last year. And
Awesome.
So my life worked out really, really well, right? But again, it took 11 years to get there. It was a really hard journey. And so I just hope that for your audience, I empathize with you. I hear you. I know how hard it can be to face adversity, but I would just encourage everyone to hang in there, dig deep, and develop your tools in your toolbox so that you can face whatever comes your way, and that you too can overcome and you too can make a difference. And the other thing I would say is share your story with somebody. You may not choose to do it as publicly as I do, and that's okay, right? Do it in a way that you feel called to. Maybe it's, sharing it with a friend or a family member or someone you encounter along the way in life. It can make the world a difference, and it can give you a meaning to your experience that will, help make you and change your perspective on all that you've been through. So I would just encourage people to hang in there. You too can overcome, and you too can make a difference.
Sure. Was it therapeutic at all to write the book?
In some ways it was. In some ways it was very cathartic. Being able to put into words what my experience was, which in some ways it felt so hard to find the words at some points because it was so indescribable. Being able to put the words down, put it on paper, and then to look back through the experience and just see the ways in which, there was so many things that happened along the way, so many blessings, so many miracles that I don't think I really realized until going back through the book and saying, wow, things were, it just changes your perspective. In other ways, it was really hard because it was reopening old wounds. It was, there was nights where as I was writing this or editing, especially deep in the editing process, where I was having those sleepless nights again, which is something that I had struggled with in the accident. It just really brought all that back to the forefront. But I'll tell you, Billy, having this book out now, it's just brought such peace to have this out there, to have people be able to, take something from it, be impacted by it. I mean, I've been amazed by how many people have approached me from all stages of life who've reached out to me through my website, or, after a speaking engagement, or after talking through Zoom. It's just been amazing, the people who've been impacted by this, who've been able to see their scars, both physical and emotional, in a new light. And it's just been really gratifying to do that. And it's just added a whole new sense of meaning. It's just really been an amazing experience. And I'm just so glad to have it out there.
That's awesome. The book is called Can You See My Scars? The author, Samuel Moore-Sobel. And you can find the book, I have here Mascot Books. Is that correct? And also Amazon.
Yes. So Mascot Books, through my publisher, or Amazon. I know everybody loves buying on Amazon, so it's there on Amazon as well for people to purchase.
Where can people find you online? I know you're on Twitter. That's kind of how you and I cross paths. Would you like to share some of those screen names with us?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter or on Instagram at @smore_Sobel. Or you can also go to my website, which is www.samuelmore-sobel.com.
Awesome. Again, the name of the book, Can You See My Scars? And you can search it by author Samuel Moore Sobel. Samuel Moore-Sobel. And thank you very much for sharing your story. Thanks for reaching out. I found a new area now. I think this, in terms of content and what we do here on the podcast, scarring is something that I don't recall talking a whole lot about over the years. And so many people have dealt with it. And for some reason, I don't remember a whole lot of discussions happening about it. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much for having me on, Billy. This was great. And thank you for the thoughtful questions. Really appreciate it.
Oh, sure. It was great to have you. Let me tell the audience, my name is Billy Dees. You can find me on Twitter as well. That's kind of like my social media home, I guess. Twitter, by the way, is built for podcasts, because of the fact that it's so real time, it's so trending, it's so topical. And you can find me on Twitter at Billy Dees on Twitter. And I use the same screen name for everything. So if you're on a certain social media platform and you want to search me out, Billy Dees. And as far as the podcast goes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, on down the line, anywhere you find us, I'm very glad that you found us and that you listen in. Sam, is it okay to call you Sam, by the way?
Yes, it is. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for being on, Sam. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great, Billy. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, yeah, it was my pleasure. I'm Billy Dees. And until next week, thank you very much for listening to the podcast. Well, hello, everyone. I am Billy Dees from the self-titled Billy Dees Podcast. You can find me on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and many more of the best podcast networks. Join me for my commentary and interviews. Follow me on Twitter, real easy to find, at Billy Dees. I am Billy Dees. I'd love to have you listen in.